KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more. Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
Welcome to KPBS Roundtable. I'm Andrew Bracken. It has been over a decade since the Fat Leonard bribery and corruption scandal hit the U.S. Navy, becoming one of the largest in U.S. military history. But misconduct from prosecutors has upended the case.
That prosecutorial misconduct, which federal judge Janice Sammartino has called flagrant and outrageous, this withholding of evidence favorable to the defense, has ended up tainting a lot of other cases.
We delve into what the rulings mean for the case going forward and look at what lessons have been learned by the Navy from its largest corruption scandal. That and the roundup later in the show. It's just ahead on KPBS Roundtable. In a decade-long saga of corruption and scandal, Leonard Francis, better known as Fat Leonard, is expected back in a San Diego courtroom Friday. Last week, 5 former officers had their felony convictions overturned due to misconduct from prosecutors. Judge Janice Sammartino called it, quote, a tragic chapter for the Navy and an embarrassment for the government. These latest developments follow years of corruption and bribery involving high-ranking members of the U.S. Navy, with Leonard Francis at the center of it all. Here to help us understand what's happening now, as well as peel back the curtain on the long journey that has gotten us here, I'm joined now by KPBS military reporter Andrew Dyer. Also here is Craig Whitlock. He's an investigative reporter with The Washington Post and author of the new book, Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Built, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. I want to welcome you both back to Roundtable. Andrew, I'll start with you. You were in the courtroom last week when these convictions were overturned. Tell us more about what happened.
Yeah, so it was quite the scene. I mean, a federal courtroom is not really a scene, I should say, but I guess in this case it was. There were a lot more people in the galley than have been at some of the previous hearings I've attended. Other attorneys, people were really interested to see how things were going to go, and I don't think it was necessarily a surprise. You know, the way the courts work is, you know, defendants have rights, and if the government is caught violating those rights, they have to, you know, by law, offer those defendants relief. And in this case, these officers, all 5 of them had previously pleaded guilty, admitted wrongdoing, admitted to a slew of crimes, mostly related to bribery. Yeah, but because of the misconduct, those felony convictions were tossed out, and one of them had their charges completely wiped and didn't have to cop to anything. But the other 4 pleaded guilty to misdemeanor, disclosing information, and were given $100 fines.
Craig, as Andrew mentioned, this wasn't the first that we heard about potential misconduct here. Tell us about what led up to, you know, what we saw last week with these cases being overturned.
There was a big criminal trial in federal court in San Diego in 2022 in which 5 current former Navy officers who had served in the Southern Fleet in Asia were on trial for bribery and conspiracy for taking bribes from Leonard Francis over the years. And 4 of those defendants were convicted by a jury, but afterward it emerged gradually, bit by bit, that prosecutors had in effect cheated by withholding exculpatory evidence or evidence that was favorable or potentially favorable to the defense. So while this didn't change a lot of the basic narrative of what happened about taking bribes, in the end, the Justice Department was forced to backpedal and let 4 of those defendants plead instead to misdemeanors. So their felony convictions were wiped out. But that prosecutorial misconduct, which federal judge Janice Sammartino has called flagrant and outrageous, this withholding of evidence favorable to the defense, has ended up tainting a lot of other cases. So last week you had these other 5 defendants who had already admitted to taking bribes, admitted guilt, Their cases were either bargained down to misdemeanors, or as Andrew said, one guy's case was wiped clean entirely. But now this could also result in the unraveling of other cases. There were 29 defendants in the Fat Leonard conspiracy case who pleaded guilty. And, so there's going to be others, even ones who have already served time in prison, who are probably going to come back to the court, and the Justice Department is going to be forced to essentially cut additional deals with more people to have their felony cases erased. And the big question is what happens to Leonard Francis? He's still waiting to be sentenced, and we don't know yet how this will affect him, but it may be favorable to him as well.
And Andrew, I think in the courtroom you mentioned you heard rumblings, reaction from experts and lawyers that there may be more to come, like Craig was talking about.
Sure, and I should point out none of them wanted to speak on the record for my reporting, so this is all kind of just stuff that they told me on background. But two attorneys, chatted with me and a couple other reporters for quite a while after the hearing, and it was, they're stunned, right? Because this is such a big disaster for the government. This case has been going on more than a decade. I mean, there are reams and reams of evidence. So many people did work on this case, attorneys, investigators. There has been just so much done in order to prosecute this vast conspiracy. And it looks like it is just completely been torpedoed. One of the defendants who was in court last Friday, he pleaded guilty in 2015. He was among the first group of officers to plead out in this case. So we're talking about relief for defendants all the way from the beginning. So, when Craig mentions how will this affect Francis, that is one of the big questions I think out there is, does this change what happens with him? Because it seems, at least what we've seen so far, every case is potentially tainted. And it just kind of depends on which defendants feel like going back into court and fighting some more.
Yeah, if I could chime in here, it's important to recognize the nature of these crimes that essentially people are getting away with. One of the defendants last week, a former Navy commander named Steve Shedd, who had been a commanding officer of a warship, the USS Milius, he had admitted on the stand and in his plea agreement to not only taking $100,000 worth of bribes from Leonard Francis, but leaking him military secrets on more than 10 occasions. He admitted on the witness stand that he was a traitor, and yet, now his case got dropped. So it isn't that his guilt was in question. He admitted he was guilty, but because of this prosecutorial misconduct in related cases, he's able to go free, and that is quite a striking turn of events. As Andrew said, it's hard to overstate the way justice has turned out.
And I think the judge did go out of her way to make clear that overturning these felonies was by no means, the officers charged here were innocent at this point, right, Andrew?
No, she said, the evidence is going to stay in the case file. None of your pleas and statements are going away. Those are going to stay on the record. It's just the outcome. So, but I mean, it is a big outcome for folks. The difference between having a felony on your record and a misdemeanor on your record is huge. Losing that felony just opens up so many more doors and opportunities, in this stage of their lives as retired officers.
Well, I think you guys both have mentioned the central character here behind it all, Leonard Francis. Craig, you just published this book called Fat Leonard. Tell us about Leonard and how he came to be involved in what would become one of the largest scandals in U.S. military history.
So Leonard Francis is a legendary character, and he has been for decades in the Navy. He is a Malaysian citizen who started a company that provided husbanding services or maritime services to Navy ships and subs whenever they pulled into ports in the Western Pacific. So if there was an aircraft carrier strike group that visited Singapore or Manila or Hong Kong, usually it was Leonard's company that was supplying fresh water and fuel and tugboats and barges and whatever the crew might need when it was visiting port for a few days. And at one point, he had over $200 million worth of contracts from the Navy and made him a very wealthy man. But one secret to his wealth was that he was also gouging the Navy and federal taxpayers for his services. He was routinely overcharging for all of these services. And the way he was able to do that was he was, in effect, bribing Navy officials, whether supply officers or contracting officials or even NCIS agents, to look the other way while he overcharged the government. And this was a formula he used to great success for a number of years. He became known for throwing wild parties as bribes with dinners that cost up to $1,000 a person. He handed out Cuban cigars to his favorite Navy officers like they were candy. And he was best known for his sex parties with lots and lots of prostitutes. So this was a figure who was known far and wide throughout the Western Pacific. But it finally caught up to him in 2013 when the Justice Department and federal law enforcement agencies mobilized more than 100 federal agents around the world and arrested him in a sting operation in San Diego. And that's how he came to be arrested in California.
And I think in your book, you document this quite well, how he sort of infiltrated the Navy, and particularly the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet out of Asia. And Andrew, you served in the Navy, and I think you were part of the 7th Fleet. Can you talk about its role in the U.S. Navy and kind of how contractors like Leonard play a role in how they operate?
So you can't really overstate the importance of the 7th Fleet when it comes to its role in not just national defense, but also in foreign policy. This is a part of the world that has been very important for many years. I was first there in 2003, and even back then with the war on terror, we have action in Afghanistan and Iraq, obviously, and there were ships, home ported in 7th Fleet that were going over there and participating in those actions. But there are several, kind of destinations, around the 7th Fleet, which is the Western Pacific. And these ports are like, they're like diplomatic stops. They serve a little bit of diplomacy. It also is, R&R for the ship crews. But, for sailors, like, hitting these ports, for a lot of us, that's why we joined the Navy. We wanted to see places like Hong Kong. I wanted to see Sydney, Australia. I wanted to see Thailand. And I got to do all of those things just because I was riding on this giant aircraft carrier that happened to pull in for a few days. And that's what the operational ships do. But for the 7th Fleet specifically, and this is a little in the weeds the way the Navy works, is there's a 7th Fleet command ship called the USS Blue Ridge. Now, the Blue Ridge was home ported in Yokosuka along with the Kitty Hawk, which was my ship. And we always looked over at the Blue Ridge with a little bit of bitterness because the Blue Ridge didn't do anything but hit ports. Their purpose was, as the Admiral's flagship, to visit ports and be this diplomatic ship. Its sailors didn't have to go and do flight ops and all this wild operational stuff. All they did was hit ports. And the officers, Craig mentioned the ones that had been on trial in 2022. These were 7th Fleet staff officers. Many of the officers caught up in this were 7th Fleet staff officers. So these were officers on the Blue Ridge who were hitting ports every 2 weeks at times. And there was, during the height of this whole conspiracy, Leonard Francis was meeting the Blue Ridge at every port and hanging out and partying with these officers. So the 7th Fleet, it's a large area, a lot of important allies, a lot of strategic and, of course, foreign policy importance there.
And Craig, as you mentioned, this is quite lucrative, this business, right? In your book, you mentioned that, just a 4-day visit from an aircraft carrier can cost something like $1 million. Can you talk a little bit about the rules in place for naval officers of what they could accept from a contractor like Leonard and kind of how Leonard worked around those rules?
Sure. The federal regulations are pretty clear that if you're in the Navy or any other branch of the federal government, you can only accept gifts worth $20 or less from a federal contractor. So everybody in the Navy went through ethics training, and they all knew, particularly contracting officers and supply officers, that they aren't supposed to accept gifts from Leonard Francis or his company worth more than $20. Yet they all, so many people, hundreds of people ignored this rule. One of the revelations in my book is that up to 1,000 people came under investigation in this case, most of them for attending dinners or parties with Leonard Francis or his company. And among them were 91 admirals. So this happened over a 20-year period where Leonard was just, frankly, living large with a lot of people in the Navy who would do things in the Western Pacific that they probably wouldn't do at home. But Andrew described the Blue Ridge, the flagship. To Leonard, that was the most important ship for him because it was the command flagship. That's where the commander of the Seventh Fleet, a 3-star admiral, that was his floating headquarters. So he put an extraordinary effort into infiltrating that command ship by bribing the staff officers. And at one point, he had 10 U.S. Navy officers, most of whom had served on the Blue Ridge, leaking him military secrets over a 7-year period. Most of these were advanced ship schedules about troop movements years or months in advance. So it's pretty remarkable. It wasn't just that he was bribing people with parties and prostitutes. It also was an extraordinary case of espionage where Leonard infiltrated the Seventh Fleet and the Navy, and these officers willingly gave him classified information for many, many years.
Was this a crime of greed, or is there any evidence that he shared classified information with any foreign government or anyone else?
There's no evidence, hard evidence, that Leonard Francis willingly shared this classified material with the Chinese or the Russians or the North Koreans, but there was a real risk there, and it's not ever been ruled out. One of the problems was Leonard would obtain these classified ship schedules showing the planned ship and submarine movements, up to 12 months in advance throughout Asia. This is very sensitive information. You don't want the enemy to know where you're sending ships because it could put crews at risk. Leonard would use this secret information to preposition his naval assets so he could make more money and overcharge the Navy more easily. So this was very valuable information to him. The problem was he didn't secure it. Once the Navy officers who were on his payroll leaked him this stuff, he kept it on unsecured computer servers, or he kept them in his desk drawers in Singapore. And the problem was, as federal investigators later found out, was that Leonard's IT manager for his company was a man of Chinese ethnicity who was actually close friends with the Chinese defense attaché in Singapore. So, there certainly was a vulnerability there. And as far as we know, the Navy has never really done a public assessment on the potential damage to national security by the leakage of this information. You almost have to assume that the Chinese could have gotten their hands on it. Now, over time, this information lost its utility years later. By the time the ships had already visited port, it wasn't that valuable anymore. But it was certainly a really raging leak of classified information that went undetected for a number of years. And I think, frankly, the Navy's been too embarrassed to really do an assessment of whether America's adversaries ever got their hands on it.
When Roundtable returns, we continue our discussion on the Fat Leonard scandal and what's next for Leonard himself.
He still has to be charged and tried for his absconding from justice. So there is more justice to come for Leonard Francis. It's just a matter of how much time it's going to take.
That's next on Roundtable.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
You're listening to KPBS Roundtable. I'm Andrew Bracken. We're talking about the latest developments in the Fat Leonard scandal, and I'm joined by KPBS's Andrew Dyer, along with the Washington Post's Craig Whitlock. And in your book, Craig, Leonard kind of comes across definitely like a con man, but also almost like a character from a 1980s action movie or something. There's a quote in your book from a naval officer saying the KGB could not have done what he did. So, how do you both think he was able to reach these high echelons of power in the U.S. Navy ultimately?
Leonard Francis was a very charismatic individual. He loved to charm people. He was Malaysian, but he'd always idolized American culture. He was a fan of Elvis and The Godfather. And I think, frankly, Navy officers underestimate him. He was this big guy. He weighed between 350 and 500 pounds over the years. He was very charming. He liked to throw parties. So I think a lot of people in the Navy just saw him as this character, this fat, jolly guy who they could have a good time with, and didn't really see him as a potential threat or risk. And this was to his advantage.
Andrew?
Sure. I mean, he just understood how to push people's buttons or pull their strings. You know, he was, like Craig said, very charismatic. He was a fun guy to hang out with. He was a fun guy to party with. And he knew what officers liked what things. He knew if this guy liked girls. He knew if this guy liked fine dining. He knew if this guy just wanted cash. He knew that because he talked to them. He knew that because he enlisted the officers on his payroll to do recon for him and tell him, okay, this is a good candidate for the conspiracy. This is a bad candidate. This guy's a Boy Scout. He had his fingers in everything. He was, Craig said he idolized The Godfather, and in many ways, he himself became a godfather. He was a bit of a gangster at the top of this organized crime ring that was hugely successful for, more than a decade. He also got to their spouses. That's something that goes kind of unremarked upon a lot of the times because it was only the Navy officers who were ever charged with anything. But when you read through the court documents, some of the statements, proffer statements, the stories that people tell, in a lot of cases, the spouses of these officers were also receiving gifts, luxury handbags, luxury watches, vacations for the family. So it wasn't just Navy officers themselves on the take, but also in some cases their spouses and families also benefiting.
Well, Craig, in your book, you do make the case that the Navy sort of has a different approach to just the amount of independence it gives its officers compared to other military branches. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. And Andrew, of course, knows this from his firsthand experience. But in the Navy, commanding officers or skippers or captains of a ship or submarine do have extraordinary independence. The Navy historically has vested this independence on them because, they're away at sea for months at a time. And in the olden days, they didn't have communications with back in Washington or at base in the U.S. So, these commanding officers have this untrammeled authority to do as they wish. Leonard recognized this, and he really understood that in the military, rank means everything. So he cultivated very carefully, in a very cunning way, his relationships with senior officers, whether it was a captain of a ship or an admiral who was in charge of a command. He was a frequent presence in the front row at change of command ceremonies. He made sure he was always included on the VIP guest list. He would bring photographers with him to take his selfies of him and these different admirals and captains. And the reason he did this is he knew it would send a message to the rest of the fleet that Leonard was friends with the people in charge. And so that meant people wouldn't challenge him when he overcharged the Navy or overbilled them for his services, or when, it was clear that he was doing things that violated ethics rules or broke the law. He knew that people were going to be very reluctant to blow the whistle on him or report him if they thought he was friends with the people at the top of the chain of command.
And one thing that's striking from the story in your reporting, Craig, and I imagine you may have come across this too, Andrew, is sort of, there were officers that participated in the corruption and the bribery, went to his parties, but there also seemed to be other officers who may have not been totally, may have realized something was wrong, but didn't really fully come out and say it, or maybe they did file a report, but then it kind of went away. So I guess, what does that say about the larger culture of the Navy as, a lesson learned from the Fat Leonard scandal, Andrew?
Well, Leonard was smart enough to try to hide his activities from kind of the Boy Scouts, or he would know who to be careful with. I think the best example is a former officer that was stationed at the Hong Kong Ship Support Office. His name was David Schaus. He was a lieutenant at the time, but he was a former surface officer, so he knew the ships, and he knew when certain ships came into Hong Kong and Leonard sent a bill for X thousand number of gallons of water pumped in and out, that the ship couldn't handle that much. And he challenged Leonard, and he was, I've talked to him a few times over the years, and, his chain of command, his bosses, they came down on him and told him, leave Francis alone. It's not your job to investigate Leonard Francis. And so there was just kind of this culture, because Leonard was such a larger-than-life figure and so well-known among the senior officers, that when people did try to speak up, it was kind of tamped down. And I don't even know the exact number, but there were reports upon reports upon reports to NCIS of this fraud over the years. For just about the whole breadth of the conspiracy, people in the Navy were reporting Francis. They were reporting him. Other contracting companies were challenging these contracts as being unfair. And there are, and I'm sure Craig knows the number, but I want to say there were upwards of 20 NCIS investigations opened and closed over the years into Leonard Francis.
There were 27 cases, criminal investigations that NCIS opened and closed into Leonard's company. Part of this was he had informants in the NCIS who would help him stay a step ahead of investigators. And also there was really a reluctance to shut him down for a number of years. But just to follow up on what Andrew said, there's one story in my book that still stays with me. This is based on documents and interviews I conducted. The USS Blue Ridge was pulling into port in Hong Kong one spring in around 2006. And the JAG officer for the 7th Fleet, this is the top lawyer, military lawyer, and ethics advisor, he sends out an email to all officers in the 7th Fleet staff saying, we're pulling into Hong Kong. Stay away from Leonard Francis and his company. Do not accept any gifts. This was a stern reminder that the federal gift limits for taking gifts from contractors was $20. He had heard rumors that Leonard was going to throw one of his patented swank dinners. And so he explicitly warned all the officers on the 7th Fleet staff to stay away. So, of course, what happens is one of Leonard's moles on the 7th Fleet staff immediately forwards this email to him. And the chief of staff of the 7th Fleet decides to ignore this warning. They go ahead with this fancy dinner in Hong Kong that costs several $100s a person. And they're openly laughing during the dinner about the JAG officer who's warning them to mind the ethics rules. And this goes on at each port visit that spring by the Blue Ridge, that despite this written warning to stay away, other officers who were on Leonard's payroll kept coming. There was one of the next port visits was in Singapore, and Leonard hosted this fantabulous dinner on the roof of a skyscraper in Singapore. And one of the people who was there was the 7th Fleet chaplain, a Catholic priest. And I interviewed him, years later. I said, didn't you get the ethics warning to stay away? Why did you ignore it? And he kind of shrugged and said, well, I did get this, but I guess I didn't put two and two together, and, shame on me for ignoring the rules. So it just goes to show that the Boy Scouts were few and far between. And even, the chaplains and the chiefs of staff and other people who all knew better, they just kind of ignored the rules, ignored the standards of what was expected of them, and decided they wanted to partake in Leonard's gifts and largesse and ignored what they were supposed to be doing.
So, have changes come out? Has the culture of the Navy changed since this scandal has come to light?
So I talked to one expert for a story a while back, and according to him, the problem is in just the Navy's reliance on contractors to start with. So much of what the Navy does, there used to be a base in Subic Bay in the Philippines. It was shut down in, I think, 1991. A volcano had erupted, and we were getting out of there anyway, and it was buried in ash. And so, that used to be one of the places where ships could get some of these services and re-up on their supplies. But after that, there was this real gap of services for these ships, and they needed it. So companies like Glenn Defense, Marine Asia were there to kind of step up. And I mean, in the last 20, 30 years, ask anybody in the military, and the reliance on contractors has only increased. So like Craig has said, people knew the rules then. They broke them anyway. The rules are still in place. Do people continue to break them? I don't have evidence that they are. I think there's probably a lot more wariness about it given this case. But then again, that's an assumption on my part.
And we'll see if these convictions being overturned has some part in that as well. Right, Craig?
Absolutely. And so one reason why the federal government charges people in cases like this, bribery and fraud, is deterrence. And they say this in court. They're trying to deter other people from this kind of behavior or misconduct in the future. So if most of these cases get dropped or go by the wayside, so does the deterrence value. But you asked a really good question, Andrew, about has the culture changed? And I think the jury's out on that. I certainly agree that people are being more careful, looking over their shoulders, realizing that they can get in trouble and they need to watch themselves a little bit. But has the culture changed? And the Navy's leadership has really been silent on that. All the reforms, the so-called reforms they imposed after Leonard Francis was arrested 10 years ago, really had to do with contracting rules and regulations, but it didn't address the culture. And in the years since, the Navy leadership has really remained silent on this whole case. It's been embarrassed by what's happened, and it doesn't want any public attention, but it's also missed an opportunity to reinstate the right values in the fleet of what people are expected to do. And I think the message that gets sent to the fleet by and large is that a lot of people who got charged are getting away with their crimes, and in particular, a lot of officers. One of the findings in my book was that 91 admirals were investigated or questioned in this case. Only one of them went to jail. So what kind of message does that send about culture or deterrence when senior officers, by and large, are getting a pass no matter what happened in their dealings with Leonard Francis? And so it's hard to change your culture when there isn't a willingness to discipline or hold people accountable who are in charge.
So Leonard was arrested all the way back in 2013. I think he pled guilty in, 2015? Mm-hmm. Still awaiting sentencing. And with, these recent issues with the Justice Department's cases, I mean, what's next for the case against Leonard Francis?
Well, he's going to be in court on Friday for a status hearing. Of course, he absconded famously from justice. A whole other part of the story we haven't talked about, but he was living in I think in Carmel Valley in some nice big house and paying for his own security. And right whenever this 7th Fleet trial ended, that was the end of his usefulness. The reason he hadn't been sentenced is because he was the government's star witness in all of these cases. So for every officer Francis helped put away, that's years off of his eventual sentence. So they can't sentence him until they go through all of these other cases. So as soon as all the cases were done, he ends up in Venezuela. He gets back here in that swap deal in December. And ever since he's been back in San Diego, he's been in the federal lockup downtown, and he's been in court, I think, 3 or 4 times at this point. And each time he comes and he talks to Judge Janice Sammartino and tells her, I'm having trouble getting a new lawyer. I'm having trouble talking to my person, back in Singapore. I'm having trouble getting access to my money. He just has these stories and kind of excuses, or maybe they're genuine. I have no reason to believe they're not, but can't find a lawyer. So without representation, she can't sentence him. And it's been one delay after the other. So Friday's status hearing, we'll find out, has he got himself a lawyer yet? And if he has, then the next step would be to schedule a sentencing hearing and for him to be sentenced. After he's sentenced, he still has to be charged and tried for his absconsion from justice. So there is more justice to come for Leonard Francis. It's just a matter of how much time it's going to take.
You both have been covering the scandal and the fallout for several years now. I'm just curious, the question for each of you as we wrap up, what has surprised you most about what you found in your reporting? Craig, I'll start with you.
Sure. So, I've been reporting on this case for over 10 years, and shortly after Leonard was arrested in 2013. And I'm still amazed at, frankly, how easy it was for Leonard to bribe and infiltrate the Seventh Fleet and the leadership of the U.S. Navy, even though this was going on in broad daylight almost, the parties and bribes and the fact that he went to Annapolis to the Naval Academy for change of command ceremonies. That nobody saw that this was a problem, not just an ethical problem, but a risk and a threat to the Navy as an institution. And really, over the last 10 years, the Navy has been unwilling to come clean about the extent of that. But Leonard Francis, it's easy to make fun of him as this big overweight guy from Malaysia who threw a lot of fun parties, but he is the biggest threat to the Navy in terms of institutionally since the tailhook scandal of the early 90s. And we still don't really know the extent of it, although I did my best to document his history of recruiting informants and moles in my book.
Andrew, what about you? What questions do you have, and what lessons do you take away from this saga?
The thing that I always come back to, and anytime you get me talking about this case, I'll talk, I think, I'll talk for like 20, 30 minutes. But, I always come back to just how all-encompassing it is. Just the staggering amount of work that went into, what Francis did. He was this mastermind, and he was involved in every little detail of every single person that was on the take. He knew that they were going into this hotel, and he was involved in every little detail across the spectrum of the Navy, the fleet officers, the contracting officers in Singapore. Just what he did was absolutely astonishing, that he was able to do this and do it for so long. How many people fell under investigation? The Justice Department, that was, about 36 people or so that actually were charged. But, the Navy itself, in its own separate administrative and criminal court system, they dealt with many more officers. So just how big the scope of the scandal is what always I have trouble wrapping my brain around. And for it to end like this, and it's still going, it's not quite over, but for it to end with the federal government just stepping on the biggest rake you can imagine, and all of this work and all of this investigation being almost for nothing, because everybody who admitted to being on the take and selling out our country and selling out our secrets, they're gonna end up with a fine and a misdemeanor on their record. It's really just, if you said in 2013 when he was arrested that this is how this would end and it would be 2024 and still going, nobody would have believed you. But that's always what I come back to whenever I try to just think about this case. It's just, it's so big you have to talk about it in parts. You cannot talk about it as one thing almost.
Well, I think we're going to have to end it there. Like you said, there is so much more to the story that we haven't gotten to. I've been speaking with KPBS Military and Veterans Affairs reporter Andrew Dyer. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Craig Whitlock also was joining us. He's an investigative reporter with The Washington Post and author of the new book, Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. Craig, thanks for being here.
You bet. Great talking with you both.
When we come back, our weekly roundup takes a closer look at this weekend's national election in Mexico. It's coming up right after the break.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
You're listening to KPBS Roundtable. I'm Andrew Bracken. It's time now for the weekly roundup, and back with us is KPBS web producer Laura McCaffrey. Hey, Laura.
Hello.
And also joining us today is KPBS border reporter Gustavo Solis. Gustavo, welcome.
Hello.
So we wanted to start quickly by talking about this weekend's election in Mexico. Gustavo, what are some things voters need to know who may be voting on Sunday?
So many things. So many things, who the candidates are, what the big issues are, and you can find all of it at KPBS. We actually just did like a big event on Wednesday, but it's available on YouTube. You can just watch it on our website. But, I mean, we'll talk about it. A historic election, likely to be the first female president, 20,000 races if you count the state and local elections as well. So just a lot riding on this election.
So people can vote from San Diego in this election. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's a brand new thing this year. Mexico has made a real effort to try to get more Mexicans who live in the United States to vote. There's something like 7 million people who were born in Mexico and are now living in the U.S. who could be eligible to vote. Here in San Diego, you can vote at the consulate in Little Italy, which is pretty exciting. I think historically that constituency group of Mexicans living abroad, very, very small. Like I said, there's more than 7 million, but less than 500,000 vote. It's a tiny percentage of the potential. So they've tapped into, I mean, it has the power to swing elections. It's potentially a very big one. Historically, it hasn't really stepped up.
Every vote counts. And like you said, historic election, because Mexico will likely elect its first female president. Tell us about the leading candidates.
Yep. And actually, speaking of every vote counting, Mexican election is a popular vote. So one person, one vote. They don't have the electoral college stuff like we do, which people always find interesting to hear. But with the candidates, the two leading ones are Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl Gálvez. And most people are framing this race as kind of a referendum of the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Claudia Sheinbaum is from the same party as López Obrador, and she's running as sort of a campaign of continuity. If you like López Obrador, she's your person. Xochitl Gálvez is, in every single sense of the word, an opposition candidate. She's actually running in a coalition of three political parties, PRI, PRD, y PAN, that are just the big historic political parties in Mexico. And some of them, like they've butted heads for decades. They don't align ideologically. Some are center left, some are center right, but all of them dislike López Obrador. So they've kind of come together, joined forces to try to defeat him in this election.
And AMLO, as he's known, he's termed out, right? He can't run for another term. Is that why he's not in this election? Because he's still quite popular in Mexico, right?
Yeah, he's still very popular. I think his approval rating is in the 60%. But no, he cannot run again. Mexico elect their presidents to 6-year terms, and very kind of infamously in Mexico's past, presidents have abused term limits, so they don't let people run again anymore.
So what are some of the top issues in this election that you're hearing from voters?
Well, the biggest one is security, or lack thereof. Right. One of the biggest criticisms of AMLO's administration is his policy to combating organized crime. He calls it abrazos no balazos, which roughly translates to hugs, not bullets. During his tenure, homicide has increased substantially, not just violence, but also extortion and kidnappings and things like that. So that's top of mind for people. Other issues include big infrastructure projects. I know here in Tijuana, that's a big issue. It impacts cross-border sewage, long border wait times. The U.S.-Mexico relationship is also kind of interesting here locally, but nationally it's trying to stop corruption and getting the security situation under control.
So, Gustavo, the election is Sunday. Do we have any idea when results will be known from the election?
Not officially, but we should expect them quickly. I know, definitely the electorate do expect them within a day or two of the election. It's not going to be like in the United States where you get weeks and weeks waiting for certain states. That's another thing about Mexico's election system. Unlike the U.S., where every county and state has a different system, Mexico has an independent federal election institute, and they oversee elections at the local, state, and federal level. So it's all one agency. And they're hoping, or in the past, that has proven to be more effective in getting votes counted quicker.
Great. So maybe as soon as Monday or Tuesday, we'll know more about the future of Mexico's president.
Yeah, we should. It'll be really, really exciting kind of to see how it turns out.
We appreciate you kind of giving us an update there. And again, there's more on our website at kpbs.org. You can find more information on the election. Laura, what stories do you have for us this week on the Roundup?
All right. So it's another Roundup quiz edition. And we roped in Gustavo for
You ready,
this.
Gustavo?
This time. Pop quiz.
All right, we'll see how it goes.
So all of these questions are based on reports that our KPBS reporters have covered this week. Our first one has to do with some sea critters. So tuna crabs, they've been showing up at La Jolla, and they're crabs, but they look like lobsters. So it's a mock lobster, if you will. An underwater photographer told KPBS that she saw a carpet of them, basically as far as the eye could see. They're subtropical critters, but it's not unheard of to see them in San Diego. So here's the question. Why have these imposter lobsters showed up? Is it A, there's been more plankton near San Diego, which is what the tuna crabs eat? B, El Nino currents brought them from Baja California waters? C, we don't know. D, it's tuna crab mating season.
Okay, so how do we do this? Do I go first or?
Just shout it out.
Go ahead.
I'm going to go El Nino. I know it's changed a lot, so I'm going to go El Nino. B.
Gustavo, what do you think?
I'm hungry, so I'm going to go A. I'm assuming they're hungry too.
It's actually B. So we're going to give that one to Andrew. Ding, ding, ding. Yay.
Boo.
Because since they're subtropical, they want those warm waters, right?
Yeah, that was a shot in the dark. I don't know why I picked B, but got it right.
Good work. All right, so let's go to the San Diego International Airport now. So SAN, as it's known, has an art program that contains both visual and performance art. The program took a break during the pandemic, as a lot of things did, but now it's back. KPBS reporter John Carroll went to go see some performances. There was jazz, percussion, dance. So our question, the art program has been in existence since 2003, but when did the performance art program start? Is it A, 2016, B, 2019, C, 2003, or D, 2010?
I have no idea. It's going to be a total guess.
D, 2010.
All right, what do you think, Gustavo?
Well, I was going to do that, but
Go.
that wouldn't be fun. No, I'm going to go with A, 2016.
So, Gustavo, you got this one right. It's A.
There
It's
we go.
2016. Yay!
Lucky guess. All right, now we're even.
Tied up.
Now, the San Diego County Fair. It's coming up, and it's 2 weeks away. This year, the theme is Let's Go Retro. So that's taking us back to 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And there's going to be some exhibits that have quote-unquote relics, like the Game Boy and DVD ROMs, which I both used. And, of course, there's food, that's known for its multiple fried delights. And so there's a new offering at the fair, the funnel cake dog, which is a hot dog and a funnel cake batter topped with syrup and sugar. So which vendor is the creator of this wonderful surprise? Is it A, corn dog surprise, B, Cali Pupusas, C, Chicken Charlie's, or D, destination unknown?
It sounds like a corn dog surprise to me. I'm going A. What about you, Gustavo?
I think it's A, and I vaguely remember seeing Alex Gwynn, right? He did this reporting.
Mm-hmm.
I saw him eating a corn dog, or what looked like a corn dog, so I'm going to go with corn dog surprise.
That's actually a made-up name.
But is it Chicken's Charlie?
It's Chicken Charlie's.
Oh, man.
That's
That was my second guess.
Have y'all heard of Chicken Charlie's before? Apparently, it's well known for his deep-fried Twinkies.
It sounds familiar, but I'm
Deep-fried
not
Oreos.
I'm not a huge deep fried person. But I know that's part of the fare, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is his newest creation, I guess. All right. So our last question is about Bill Walton. He was a former NBA player and sports broadcaster and local San Diegan. So he died Monday after living with cancer. He was 71. Grew up in La Mesa. He loved San Diego so much. He used to have a stutter, but he overcame that and became a very successful broadcaster. He won Emmys. And he was known for saying some pretty outrageous stuff. So our question here, which one of these quotes is not something Walton said? And I got these quotes from a USA Today article. So, is it A, you don't win championships by just being normal, by just being average? B, I've had 36 orthopedic operations, have 2 fused ankles, my knees, hands, and wrists don't work. I now have a fused spine. Other than that, everything is great. C, but you have to understand, my beard is so nasty. I mean, it's the only beard in the history of Western civilization that makes Bob Dylan's beard look so good. Or is it D, Toronto, to me, is a clean New York?
I'm going to go D, Toronto, clean New York. I'm pretty sure the 36 operations, I know he had a ton of operations. And he used to carry around a chair when he would go places because his back was so injured.
What do you think, Gustavo?
Yeah, I think B is too specific to be made up. I'll go with A.
All right, it's actually D.
Ooh.
Charles Barkley actually said that for some
So
reason.
Another very well-known basketball figure. But yeah, it's been interesting hearing a lot of the stories about Bill Walton and his impact, as you mentioned. Like he's from San Diego. KPBS's Thomas Fudge did a story on his legacy and spoke with sports reporter Jay Paris. And here's a little of what he had to say about what San Diego kind of meant to him. So I'll throw to that now.
He loved the Grateful Dead, but I think he even loved San Diego more. And for him to come home to play for the Clippers, to play in the sports arena, which still stands today, and have his families and friends there, it had to be one of the greatest feelings in his life.
And I think there you hear he's obviously was known as a basketball player first and foremost. He played on these famous UCLA teams, but he was also known for his love of music, of the Grateful Dead, as you heard there, and being around town. I think a lot of people ran into him at various places. A lot of times the YMCA I go to has a statue of him outside. He was very like a big bike rider around town too.
Mm-hmm. I think he was quoted as saying something like, I love my bike, I love San Diego, and I love solar power. I guess he was into that.
I'm not a basketball fan. Honestly, most of what I know about him is him going really hard after Todd Gloria because of homelessness issues and him being connected with that plan to build a camp and put people there for a while. I'm not sure what that means for his legacy, but it's always nice to have people who grew up here get success and come back here or just fall in love with San Diego. I feel like people outside San Diego think of this as a small town, kind of like a stepping stone. They'll go up to LA or San Francisco or something, but I'm a big fan of hometown pride.
Gustavo Solis, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, no, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. I'll try to do better on the quiz next time.
No, you did great. Well, what was the final tally? Actually,
you won, I think, 2-1,
You
3-1.
got
Okay.
2 out of 4.
All right,
Gustavo got 1.
We need a prize of some sort next time. Well, Gustavo, thanks again for being here. Laura, thanks as always for being here on the Roundup.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
That'll do it for the Roundtable this week. Thanks so much for being here. We'd love to hear from you. You can leave us a message at 619-452-0228. You can also email us at roundtable@kpbs.org. You can listen to KPBS Roundtable anytime as a podcast. Our show airs on KPBS FM at noon on Fridays, again Sundays at 6 a.m. Roundtable was produced by Laura McCaffrey and me, Andrew Bracken. Brooke Ruth is Roundtable's senior producer. Brandon Trufa is our technical producer, and I'm your host, Andrew Bracken. Thanks again for listening, and have a great weekend.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.